Hi, and welcome to the Take the Stage podcast. I'm your host, Alexis Alvarez, and I'm on a mission to help make diversity more of a reality for lower middle market and middle market investment firms. Take the Stage celebrates and amplifies diverse voices and serves as a platform for conversations that encompass a wide range of perspectives. You're going to hear candid conversations that touch on career paths, the not so linear kind, valuable insights, practical advice, and honest stories on navigating and succeeding on the buy side. Today on Take the Stage, we sit down with Charles Hudson, founder and managing partner of Precursor Ventures, an early-stage venture capital firm focused on pre-seed and seed investments in the US and Canada. Charles has made it his mission to find the kind of talent traditional VCs tend to overlook. First-time founders without elite credentials, but with bold ideas, sharp insights, and a bias toward action. In this episode, we're going to cover what it takes to spot potential without falling into the trap of pedigree, how he cultivates trust-based influence instead of control, how to tell if a founder really wants to build or just wants to want it, why staying calm during chaos is one of the most underrated leadership skills, how backing weird ideas often starts with backing people who don't fit the mold, and more. Today on Take the Stage, we are joined by Charles Hudson, founder and managing partner of Precursor Ventures. Charles has backed over 400 founders at the very earliest stages, before traction, before buzz, and sometimes even before there's a product. So today, we're going to dive into how he spots potential, stays calm in the chaos, which is one point that I really am looking forward to touching on. And I think everyone needs to hear that, hear this, especially now. And also bets on overlooked founders and markets. So Charles, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. So normally I field easy questions or warm-up questions, but I'm not going to do that today. We have a lot to tackle. So we're going to go straight into it. So you built Precursor to back founders who weren't getting attention from traditional VCs. Yeah. So how has your definition of overlooked talent evolved since you started Precursor, and where do you think are today's biggest blind spots?
Boy, so first of all, thank you for having me. But second, I think if you zoom out and look at what most venture capitalists optimize for, it tends to be a couple of things. It's brands on the resume. So, schools that they recognize, maybe companies that they recognize where somebody was, in an important role. Social proximity, which can be either people you've worked with, people you live near, people you have some affinity for. And I think historically that's been like the lens. It's people I know from places that I recognize, working on businesses that I understand or appeal to me. And I am by no means saying that is a bad way to invest. I'm simply saying it's not the only way to invest. And if your lens is, it has to be people I know, coming from institutions that I know, working on problems I understand, that's a very limiting frame of who you're going to interact with and who you're going to fund. And if you open that aperture a bit and just say, well, what would happen if I funded people that I didn't know? Or what would happen if I funded people who were from institutions that maybe I don't know as well? And I just felt like nobody was underwriting those founders. And I think in venture, you can lose a lot of money by trying to re-underwrite people that other people have sort of like already met with and said they're not up to snuff. What I found, though, is that the founders I'm interested in, people who didn't just go to Harvard and Stanford and who weren't employee number one at OpenAI, like there's a lot of talent out there that has really good ideas. They just lack the social proximity that makes saying yes easy. And I said, well, what if we had a venture firm that could do two things at once? That could definitely do the right down the fairway, repeat founder, well-known person. We absolutely are capable of working with and funding those people, and they're a part of our strategy. But what if we also could roll out the welcome mat to people who don't normally get as warm a reception? And I had this really strong belief that nobody was doing the underwriting of this other talent pool, and that if we started looking there, we would find some great talent.
Awesome. I like that. I talk a lot about this. I talk about, this playbook mentality that is
Mm-hmm.
just so deeply ingrained in VC, PE, across the board. And so let's actually take a step back,
Yeah.
because I want to know now. Now that I started thinking, how did you get to this point? Like, how did you get to the
Yeah.
point
Yeah.
where you're like, wait. There has to be a different way. What kind of bring us back?
I think there are two big things happened. One personal, one professional. The professional one was before I started Precursor. I was a partner at a firm called Encore and had a really great experience there. That firm has continued to scale. In fact, they just announced their new fund today. And when I looked at a lot of the founders that I was attracted to and who also did well for me as investments, they were mostly first-time founders who were not right out of central casting. They had recently moved to the Bay Area, or they're recent immigrants, or they hadn't gone to like schools that people would recognize, or they hadn't worked at Google, Facebook. Like they weren't the typical archetype. But when I met them, I saw something special in them. And those were the investments that for me worked well. And I said, okay, well, probably the best way to make money as an investor is to lean into the thing that's working for you. And I'm like, finding these people is working for me. And to be clear, these people were in the Bay Area. It wasn't like I had to go all the way to the ends of the earth to find them. They were here. They just weren't fully in the inner circle.
Mm-hmm.
So that was one. The second thing is, I'm from Michigan, but I moved to California to go to Stanford. So I have 2 degrees from Stanford, but I'm Black. And so there are sometimes I'm like, wow, would I be in this room that I'm in if I didn't have 2 degrees from Stanford and like weren't part of the VC ecosystem? And I look around and I'm like, I might be the only person that looks like me in this room. So it's probably safe to say the answer is no.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, well, I've had this experience of like knowing what it's like to get this sort of like access card that lets you get into different rooms. And I've seen how like people have responded once I'm in those rooms. And I'm like, oh, there are lots of other smart people who don't have the same advantages that I do. And so I was able to kind of see life through 2 different lenses. And I was like, well, this is not a singular experience. There are other great people out there who I think are just as talented and smart. They're just not getting a shot to be in this room. And what if we expanded who could be in the room, not to exclude anybody, but to include more people?
Mm-hmm. At what point did you know you wanted to do VC? Because that's another.
Oh man, it's super. I think like almost all VC, unless you're like a multi-generational like venture capitalist, like your parents did it, which does absolutely happen in our business. I didn't know anything about venture. I mean, I came here from Michigan. My dad worked in the auto industry and my mom was an attorney. And, sometimes life just, these funny twists of fate. I was an intern at an internet company in the early 2000s. And one of the people I worked with, her husband ran a venture fund. And I was trying to decide, well, what am I going to do once I graduate from college? I was talking to her. I said, I think I'm going to go do investment banking in New York, or I'm going to do management consulting. And she just said, hey, my husband has this venture capital firm. I think you should go talk to him about what he's building. He could use some help. And I went and met with him. I didn't really know, Alexis, what venture capital was. But I was like, this is an investing job. I'm interested in investing jobs. And I took it as a lark. So my first venture job was working for the Central Intelligence Agency's venture capital arm. And I went into that job mostly because I was like, of all the things I could do out of college, this is by far the most interesting opportunity that's being presented to me. And let's just like follow the interesting thing. And that ended up being a great exposure to venture capital. I learned a ton. I met a lot of people and pretty quickly concluded that this was a job that I found very, very interesting.
Hmm. That's the CIA investment arm, just to be just to
Yep.
be clear.
Yep. The
That
one
must
and
be a
only.
that must be a really great, that must have been, and probably still is, pretty good conversation starter.
It
Am I
works.
right? All right. That's awesome. Now everyone's gonna, like, that doesn't know you, gonna look at your LinkedIn profile and be like, "What
Hmm.
is this?" I've never heard of
Hmm.
it before. Awesome. Yeah. I mean, this is that is the common thread. You're 100% right. When you kind of just fall into it is what I've
Yeah.
learned in speaking with, so many different people. And I feel like most of the time it's across the entire alternative investment space,
Yep.
unless of course you've had that exposure coming from your family.
Hmm.
I always joke, you never hear a little kid say, one day I want to be the managing partner of a lower middle market, private equity focused investment. But, you don't just say that, right?
As a boy, I knew I wanted to be in private credit.
Right, exactly,
It doesn't
exactly.
happen.
It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. I find myself, I have 3 kids, and I find myself talking to them as much as possible about this space. And
Hmm.
I have a daughter that's in the preteen, almost teenager space. And of course, she's very on trend with everything that, girls her age are doing in terms of, skincare and all
Hmm.
the, that world. And anyways, there's a product that she uses, and it was a private equity backed product. And so I
Wow.
was like, perfect opportunity to to really to tell her about it. And so, every time we talk about it, she's just like, yeah, I know it was a private equity backed. It was acquired for however much. I'm like, you got to start them young. You got to start them young and
Yeah.
get them, talking about these things. And because same thing, I fell into private equity, or I fell into recruitment in this space, through just kind of a friend of mine,
Yeah.
and it is that common thread.
Yep.
Um, okay, all right. So we went a little bit off course here. So I want to get back to precursor here. I like to, I guess it's the recruiter in me, and the
Hmm.
interviewing and understanding the decisions that drive us to, where we are in the present day. So going back to the founders. So all right. So once you find your founders, the next challenge is always deciding who to back, especially when there's very little data to go on. So how do you
Hmm.
sharpen your intuition for true founder potential without
Yeah.
falling into those traps of pattern recognition?
Well, I think it's an excellent question, and it's something we've spent a lot of time as a firm trying to refine. And I always try to ask myself, if you put away the resume, what are the attributes that you need to be successful? And again, remember, we're doing 0 to 1, like idea, no product, no traction. Number one, you have to have a real comfort with discomfort. You have to be really
Mhm.
comfortable with ambiguity. So usually I'm looking for evidence in people's prior work or personal lives that they've willingly put themselves into an uncomfortable situation. And so ironically, like if you went to Harvard and then Stanford and worked at Google for 5 years and then Meta for 5 years, you've probably had a great career. I'm not sure that that's the best preparation for doing a from scratch startup. Most of the people we back who've been successful have done one or two things that like take them off the gilded path and that were risky. So one, that's one thing I'm looking for. Second, in a 0 to 1 startup, when you're the founder, nobody tells you what to do. You have to figure out two very important things: what to work on every day, and at what pace should the company be executing in order to hit its objectives. And I find if you've been a part of a 0 to 1 or an early stage, we'll call it a sub 20-person company, whether that company was ultimately wildly successful or not, you have some sense of how fast you're supposed to move as a startup. And I find that like that urgency and that ability to sort of get stuff done on a daily basis is really important. And I find people who've been in really early stage startups and choose to do them again are basically voting with their feet and saying, I like that experience. I want more of it. The other things I really care about are what's the quality of the insight that the person has about the problem they're trying to solve and where did that insight come from? Is it an insight that was earned because you worked in the category? Or is it an insight that was earned because you're looking at it from the outside in and saying, hey, the way that this thing works, does it make sense? And the interesting thing is about half of our most successful portfolio companies were started by people who are building in a category they already know. But the other half were started by people building in categories where they are new to it. And so we've seen it's funny, Alexis, we've backed over 1,000 founders. We have successful archetypes of almost every type. We have your classic engineer who's building a product in a category where they were working on the same thing at their old company. We have solo, non-technical female founder who's never worked in a startup, but like we've had every, and that's the funny thing. If you invest in enough companies and you have an open mind, you eventually start to realize there are many, many, many archetypes for successful founders, but the personality traits seem to be the same, which is that they're very driven. They're good at recruiting. They're good communicators about the importance of the idea that they're working on. And in general, they're very good resource allocators. They're very good at figuring out what are the most important things to work on and why those things are important. But when most of the people we back, about 2/3 of them are first-time founders. So we're literally hiring people for a job they've never had before.
You said a lot of things that I think are just really are very interesting, and I'm not really sure where to land on next because I'd love to touch on all of that. I mean, the first thing that you mentioned was the comfort with discomfort, because that truly is a skill, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It is.
Managing heartburn and right, that feeling in the pit of your stomach, whatever you want to call it, is difficult. And so it kind of that to me, I feel is something that even if you're outside of VC or the investment space is really a skill that few people, that we all need to have, but few people have. How do you feel is the best way to develop that, because everyone can say, yeah, you have to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but how do you truly do that?
I think I was talking to a friend of mine who's in venture, and he's sort of on his way to retirement, and I asked him how he's spending his time. And he told me he's taken up contemporary dance. And I said, do you know how to dance? He's like, no, I'm the worst dancer in this class, but I'm not trying to get on Broadway. I'm doing this for fun. And I went into this knowing I'm going to be worse at the beginning than I will be at the end of this class. And I find that people are just oh, well, how do you find these tests? It doesn't have to be something heroic. Mm-hmm. But I think finding ways to try things where you're not going to be at the top of the class at the beginning, or learning new skills. I find that people who are interested in learning new skills generally have the ability to say I am not good at this today, but with practice and preparation and education, I can actually get good at this thing. And, one founder I backed, they went from never running to running half marathons. And I talked to the person about their journey, and they're like, I used to get winded at a mile. And I was like, well, how am I going to run 13 miles? And the person's like, well, first I have to go from 1 mile to 2 miles. And if I can go from 1 mile to 2 miles, then maybe I can go from 2 miles. And he just sort of walked me through the progression. And I'm like, well, that's kind of the entrepreneurial journey. Mm-hmm. I'm like, you don't start out trying to manage a 100-person company. You start off managing a 5-person company, and then you grow into managing a 15. And I was like, these are all these stepwise progressions. But I do find that the people I'm looking for are curious about learning and development and growth, and are willing to put themselves in positions where they know they might not be awesome. And this is going back to something I said earlier. I find highly credentialed people have very safe paths that they can stay on that are very lucrative, very high status. And quitting a high status job to go start a startup that no one's heard of is not what most people want to do. They've worked very hard to get onto the path of high status lily pads, mm-hmm. and they tend to stay on them. So I'm the people who get off them either are highly motivated to do so, or are just making big career decisions that are not well informed. But you can usually suss that out pretty quickly in a meeting.
That was what I was going to ask you, because, I working in lower middle market and venture, you always cross paths with candidates that are coming from very large multinationals, very prestigious, who decide that they want more skin in the game, or they want to be more hands-on. And that was what I was going to say. Like, I have my own process. How do you weed out the ones that are truly, 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 set on paving a path in that direction?
I think one of the things, it's funny, I interview probably not as skillfully as you. I interview a lot of candidates for our portfolio companies. And sometimes I tell founders, I met this candidate. They're not trying to lie to you. They're fooling themselves. Like, I'll give you an example. I met somebody who was interviewing at one of our portfolio companies. It was at the time a 5-person company. And at the end of the interview, I said, hey, what else are you considering? And this was a fintech company. And the person said, well, I'm deciding between SVB, back when SVB was like one point, the old SVB, and your portfolio company. And I said, well, those are not the same thing. He's like, what do you mean? I go, like, those two jobs offer you nothing in common. One is an adventure and one is like a pretty safe career. So you cannot actually be equally interested in these two paths. You don't owe me the truth, but like, you owe it to yourself to be honest about what you're looking for. And I think one of the challenges is I meet a lot of people who, this is maybe a little woo-woo, their own self-image is of somebody who wants to take risk and go on an adventure. But that like idealized version of themselves clashes with the realistic version of themselves who doesn't really want to do that, but wants to be the kind of person who wants to do that. And a lot of what I'm always trying to suss out is like, do you really want this, or do you want to want this? Because if you want to want this, you shouldn't do it.
Isn't it funny? So, I feel like when you interview a lot of people, you're half interviewer, half psychologist, and trying to ask this. And I've had calls where I've talked to candidates, and it's been like at the end they've been like, "You're right. This isn't the opportunity." Like, they were really convinced, like. better to determine that now than to move on.
Yeah. And a lot of times I just try to ask people, why are you doing this? Like, why, like, of all the things you could do, why this? And I find, and I think sometimes people are doing it out of spite. They're like, I'm so mad. I had this idea at my old company and they wouldn't let me do it. And I'm like, well, they might have been right. Maybe it isn't a good idea, but like, at least I understand your motivation. Your motivation is like, you think you have a good idea. Your previous employer told you it wasn't a good idea. And oftentimes I'm trying to figure out like, well, what is it that's motivating you? And sometimes people are just like, I've always wanted to do a startup. I'm like, that is not good motivation for starting a company. Like, that is not going to carry you through the dark days. And if I can figure out their motivation, I can usually figure out like, when things get hard, and they will get hard, what is this person going to fall back on to like power through those low moments?
Yes. Awesome. That's a really good way to look at that. Our approaches are similar, but very different at the same time. I was going to ask you, because I thought it was really interesting, but one of the things that you mentioned was how there's many archetypes, but the personality traits are the same. And before you said that, you had mentioned that the quality of insight to the problem that they're trying to solve. And I find that really interesting, like the way that you phrase that, because you have people that might not necessarily have that experience in the category that they're right. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Because I find that fascinating.
Yeah. I'll tell you kind of the rubric I use. So most of my pitch meetings are 30 minutes. They're not that long. And someone will usually describe a problem to me. And instantly my head is like, how would I solve this problem knowing nothing? And I'm a generalist. So most times people bring me problems that I'm like, I don't know that much about this problem. So as a naive person, how would I solve the problem? And if by the end of the call, I'm like, you know what, my naive solution is the thing that they're building, that's probably not good, because it's either like a trivial problem to solve, or neither of us has thought enough about this problem or studied it enough to know the actual underlying reason that like the problem still exists. And the companies I end up investing in, usually the founders will reveal something to me in the course of the meeting that is a non-obvious reason the problem still exists and has not yet been solved. And sometimes it's like there's a new technology shift that suddenly makes this possible where it wasn't possible before. Like a lot of the AI companies I meet today, they're like, this was just a hard problem before AI. Now that we have AI, this problem is like less difficult. Sometimes people are like, it's a business model innovation. Like everybody charges a fortune for this thing. We have a model where we can make it free to the end user and monetize in some other way. And we think that's going to enable us to sort of like build a breakthrough. In some cases, it's a customer segment that no one's paid attention to because they've been hard to serve in the past. And this person has some insights about it. And I'd say the fourth thing is sometimes people combine bits of information that are kind of in the ether, but no one's sort of tied them together in a clever way. But usually when I get excited, there's something that my naive exploration of that topic does not or did not reveal right away. But like normally I am discovering something about that problem that I did not know at the beginning of the call. And, sometimes it's a big reveal. The person's like, here's the big thing I've learned. And there is a bit of a dramatic build. In other cases, they just state it as a matter of fact observation. And I'm like, I think that's more profound than you realized. And if I don't have that feeling at the end of the pitch meeting, I rarely invest.
Okay, so let's go to the next step. So, even when you pick well, startups are always going to be a wild ride. And going back to that point about, comfort with discomfort, let's talk about comfort with discomfort for you.
Yeah.
Because, some of the things that, that I have come across is, your approach to stillness, right? And how that is one of the more important things that you can offer during hard times. So can you maybe share with us a real moment when staying calm made the difference for a founder, and maybe even change the trajectory of a company?
I'll give you an example. I had a company that was building a B2B business. I won't say it was in a vertical category. I don't want to out the company. And the founder had two elements to his business model. He had like a Shopify like store element, and he had like an eBay like marketplace element to the business. And he was kind of on the fence about which way to go. And he was going to go raise money. And I talked to him and he said, this is very clear to me that my customers like the Shopify experience, not the eBay experience. I was like, well, what's the conflict? And he said, well, all the investors I'm talking to want me to build the eBay experience because they like the marketplace idea better. And I'm like really wrestling with this. And I said, well, let's fast forward a year. Would you rather be in a position where you followed your own intuition and instincts? Or would you rather optimize for investors? And I was like, let's just like game this out. It's actually not that complicated. There's you do what you think and it works out. There's you do what you think and it doesn't work out. There's you do what the VCs think you should do and it works. I'm like, there's four, let's just simplify the world. And I was like, how would you feel in each of these? Let's just go quadrant by quadrant. How would you feel a year from now in each of these quadrants? And he's like, oh, it's very clear to me that I would feel much better in all of the quadrants where I do the thing that my customers are telling me to do. I was like, so what's stopping you from simply doing that? And he's like, I don't know. I was like, well, let's like Just like think about that for a little while. And he's like, I'm worried that I won't be able to raise money if I don't do the thing that the investors want me to do. And I was like, well, that's a belief. Doesn't make it true. And I was like, I think you will be a more confident salesperson for the equity that you're going to sell in this company if you go to market and pitch the thing that you really believe in, not the thing that people really want to hear. Mm-hmm. And that company has done phenomenally well. The marketplace idea was completely the wrong direction for the company. And this person has become one of the more confident CEOs that I work with. Not overly confident, but he's learned to really trust his judgment. And as an aside, I feel like a lot of my job is helping unlock for people, particularly for first-time founders, the ability to have belief and trust in their own judgment. Because I think when you're a first-time founder, a lot of things in the ecosystem work to make you feel insecure or to believe that you don't know enough or you're not smart enough and that you need to go read a book or you need to go like ask somebody who's more experienced. And I'm like, no, the answers like very much might be inside of you. You just need to learn to trust your own instincts. And for a lot of first-time founders, that is a behavior they must learn.
Yeah, it can be lonely at the top in many ways, right? That resonated quite a bit because you're always if you're a business owner, you're always second guessing yourself.
Always.
Right? I mean that's part of the discomfort. Go ahead.
But also, I always tell my team, we have no control as venture capitalists. We do not make control investments. We do not control these companies. So like let go of any illusion that we have control. If we're lucky, we have influence. And like influence has to be cultivated and developed, and influence comes from trust. And you don't build that overnight, and you shouldn't misuse your influence either. But I'm constantly reminding my team, like, our job is to be a good partner to the founders. And that means sometimes telling them things they don't want to hear. You can only do that when there's like a bank of trust you can draw upon. Sometimes it's telling them to do nothing when the urge is to do something. And I feel like this is the other thing I find with founders. They tend to be action-oriented people. And sometimes problems arise. And I'm like, the optimal thing to do right now is to do nothing. Is to simply like watch this thing. It's so hard. They're like, this thing happened. I'm like, we don't have to knee-jerk reaction. Like, let's just take a beat and think about this before we respond, before you write that message, before you like, just simply let's just take a beat, because this doesn't actually require an immediate response. This is like your nervous system freaking out. Like, let's just take a beat. And in so many cases, they're like, I can't take a beat. I'm like, well, what would happen if we just did nothing for the next hour with this problem? Like, I had a company that had like a little mini kerfuffle online, and they're like wanted to jump in. And I was like, well, if you jump in and stir the pot, this is definitely going to be like Barbra Streisand effect type thing. Like, just leave it alone. Just like leave it alone. See if and the thing burned out of its own accord because something else got the internet's attention and people moved on from the item. And I was like, had you shown a light on that, you might have actually made a small thing a big thing. And so doing nothing was actually the optimal choice. But it's so hard for founders sometimes to believe that like doing nothing is actually the right answer.
I feel like part of that comes with maturity, right? Because I feel like if you looking back on my own life and I think, oh, I would so quick to react, you know, and with age and, you know, good experiences and bad experiences, which are part of the process and need to be those negative experiences need to happen as much as we don't really want to experience them. But I feel like the stillness and the maturity, or the stillness and the taking a breath and pausing really comes like, you know, I feel like in my 40s, I am way more like than I was in my 30s, and
Yep.
for sure in my 20s, right?
For same, like the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you see like I don't know how like the average age of your founders, but can can do you feel like it's maybe you see a young founder and there's a level of maturity that maybe like a 40-year-old doesn't have? Do you see that often?
I found that like there's a rough correlation between maturity and age, but it's not perfect. We have some very mature, and I find that like many of our, I mean, one of the things we try to test for is self-awareness. Like, does the founder have any sense at all about how the world perceives them versus how they perceive themselves?
Uh-huh.
And we have some remarkably mature 20-year-old founders in our portfolio. And we have some shockingly immature founders that I've met, not the ones we've invested in, that I've met in their 40s and 50s. I'm like, wow, you still don't really understand how you're showing up in the world. And I think last time we checked, like our average founder is like in their 30s, because they've typically like had some work experience and like they know enough to start a company. They're not college dropouts for the most part. I think the more fascinating thing is I have founders I've worked with for 8 to 10 years. They are by no means the same person they were when I met them. They've gotten married, they have children, they've matured. And it's really interesting for me to sometimes poke fun at them by reminding them like of what the 8-year-old ago version of them was like. And as a way to like remind them how far they've come. And that's part of what one of my investors is like, you're like a talent scout. I'm like,
Yeah.
that's how I think of my job. I am trying to find people who have like enormous stores of potential that has not been converted. And that over the course of a 7 to 10 year founder journey, they're going to become amazing leaders of people and builders of company. But like the person I meet today is not the person I expect to work with 8 to 10 years from now. I'm a different person in this job than I was 8 to 10 years ago.
So moving on a little bit, beyond people, you've also been early to spot. You've been early to big cultural shifts. So in investing in markets that maybe weren't yet obvious to others. So my question is, how do you spot cultural inflection points early? Before they're obvious, and decide that they're investable markets and not just short-term fads.
I think we have two advantages as an early stage VC. Everybody I meet is working on a future oriented problem. And if you meet thousands of people a year, you start to be like, wow, a lot of people seem focused on area XYZ. There must be something happening there if I've met 5 good teams that want to tackle that problem. The other thing is because I'm a generalist, I'm not locked into any one theme. So if it's a year where fintech isn't that interesting because like there aren't interesting problems to be solved in fintech, I don't have to like stare at fintech to find something interesting to do. I can go work on digital health because there are more interesting problems in digital health that year. If the next year digital health isn't that interesting, but consumer is, I can spend more of my time in consumer. So because we're generalists and I don't come into the year with like the Moses tablet, these are the 8 themes that are going to be interesting to me this year. I'm just like, I have no themes. I just want to meet people. Like, I invested 2 of my more recent investments were a refrigeration and freezing technology company and a dog boarding ranch. Neither of those were on my bingo card for the year. I had 0 plans to invest in anything like either of those companies whatsoever. And I just happened to meet 2 really talented, very impressive founders who convinced me that there was a there there. And I was like, I'm open to the idea that these are good ideas, that these are investable themes that we should put the firm's money behind. And I think if you're going to be a pre-seed investor, going back to the discomfort thing, you have to be comfortable with people thinking the things you invest in are silly, weird, or dumb. Like I told one of my friends about the freezer company. He was just like, I don't get it. But the founder who started that company started an ice cream company. And I was like, what was one of your biggest problems? He's like, you can only sell ice cream in places that you have freezers. And he's like, most freezers are big and bulky. And he's like, I always wanted to be able to sell ice cream in more places. Now, it turns out there's a lot of other things you can sell than ice cream, but he's building a freezer that's about the size of an air fryer.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he brought it to my office. I've seen it. I'm trying to convince him to give me one for my home, not for ice cream, for other stuff. And I was just like, this person has a bunch of unique insights on this problem from his past experience. And so I don't know. I don't mind it when people tell me that we invest in things that are silly or weird or they don't understand. I'm like, that's my job. My job is to find things before they're obvious. If people think everything I'm doing is a good idea, then we're not actually finding non-obvious ideas.
Mm-hmm. That you answered a lot of what I had been thinking about, like a couple questions ago when you were talking about, like the insights that the problems that they, that they're bringing, that they're trying to solve for.
Yep.
And so I thought that was a good example. But I mean, this is a lot of, like, I feel what you've touched on is diversity of thought, diversity of, in terms of, not only from the types of founders, but the kinds of problems. And this is, you're seeing, this is the differentiated deal flow that everyone, like talks about, right? So
Yep.
but at the same time, I mean, you're, kind of going back to the, how, like, how do you decide? I mean, it seems like it's more about like, what is the problem? It's how are they solving it? What is the problem, right?
It's a lot of it. Also, I always ask myself, what needs to be true for this to be a really big business? So call it $100 million a year in revenue or more. And like, how hard, as I tell my team, how hard do I have to squint to see that version of reality? And sometimes you have to squint really hard. And those am always like, do we want to work on something that's this hard? We could wait to find something where we don't feel like we have to squint as much to see the future. Those ideas I find there's like an optimal amount of squinting to do, I guess. If it's so easy, then I assume there's going to be lots of competition and it's probably not a great opportunity for us. And if you have to squint so hard, I'm like, maybe that's too hard.
Mm-hmm.
So there's an optimal amount of like discomfort and difficulty that I think makes for a good pre-seed or seed stage company. It has to be far enough out that people are like, I can kind of see how that would work, but like a bunch of things would have to fall into place. And it can't be so easy that everyone's like, well, of course, that's a good idea.
Mm-hmm. A little bit of squinting.
Yeah, a little bit of squinting helps.
A little bit of squinting. Okay. All right. So to wrap up, let's talk directly to any founder that might be listening, because obviously after meeting thousands of entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs and business owners, you've seen obviously what works and what could potentially stall. So what's one thing that you wish every founder truly understood about themselves before they ever ask for funding?
I definitely think every founder should try to like self-assess themselves through the eyes of people who are looking at them. And it's I think being honest, and it's bringing way more strengths to the table than you're giving yourself credit for. I don't know why you're being so modest about your achievements. In other cases, I meet teams, I'm like, well, I met a team that was building an AI product and didn't have a technical person on the team. I'm like, guys, this is an obvious gap that I would expect you to have a really good story for or plan to address, because this is a pretty big threshold issue in your plan. And like, they didn't really have a great answer for it. And I was like, well, if I were self-scouting myself and trying to figure out what are my strengths and weaknesses walking this meeting, that would have been at the top of the list. And I think that's really important to understand, like both. I think sometimes founders focus too much on these are the things we don't have in our company. I don't have money. I don't have a product. I'm like, yeah. Well, I knew all that coming in. What do you have? What are the things that make your company especially unique? And like, how do we spend more time talking about the things you have than the things you lack?
Mm-hmm. Like, what do you have?
Yeah. I'm always like, but you have all these great things.
Okay, I like that. Thank you. Just the way you said it.
Yeah. Like,
what are we working with then?
That's right. I'm like, we've covered all of the deficiencies. That's not why we're here.
Okay. Well, we're gonna wrap on that note. That's solid. Solid advice. Everything that you've mentioned here. So thank you for sharing your wisdom and your process and allowing us to kind of enter your headspace for a little while. I'm going to do a little plug for you. So for anyone listening who wants to dive deeper, you should definitely check out Charles's writing on Substack, and of course the work that Precursor Ventures is doing to back the next generation of founders. So thank you again, Charles. You're a delight.
This was so fun.
I think why every founder should work with you.
Well, thank you.
Every founder should work with you. You're awesome. I mean, just the whole partnership. I don't know. I don't know. Now you're going to get a huge influx of.
We love volume.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Charles.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to Take the Stage. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave a rating and review. To hear past shows, please go to our website, career-rockstars.com. If you are a company or candidate who would like to work with Career Rockstars, reach out on LinkedIn or send an email to Alexis at career-rockstars.com. Thanks again, and until next time.